It may be easy to forget because we all know how the story ends, but in the spring of 1940, as Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain, a German invasion seemed imminent, and the fate of the UK hung precariously in the balance. In his new book, writer Erik Larson zeroes in on that first year of Churchill's leadership in Parliament, in war, and in the behind-the-scenes politicking with an isolationist America. It's called The Splendid and the Vile, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz, and it brings Erik Larson back to our studio. So nice to see you again.
Thank you.
You were here for your book on the Lusitania.
Yes,
We're glad that you apparently thought I didn't screw up that interview so badly that you didn't want to come back.
No, here I am.
And should we point out how appropriate that you're drinking tea for this interview as opposed to water? Tea time here at TVO. There are a million different stories you could tell if you wanted to tell a World War II story, and yet you've chosen to tell a story about Churchill's first year. How come?
Well, it's really not the first year that drew me to the story. I was drawn to this story by a very specific question, which came to me after I moved from Seattle on the west coast of the U.S. to New York City, and I had this epiphany that 9/11, as experienced by New Yorkers, was a magnitude of an order of magnitude different than what anybody else had experienced. Even you might have watched the collapse of the towers live on television, and that was, obviously you could hear and see and smell things, but really that sense of violation of your home city. I started thinking, what would that have been like to have been in London when essentially, the first phase of the Blitz, there were 57 consecutive nights of bombing, metaphorically 57 consecutive 9/11s, followed by 6 months of intensifying air raids at intervals. And I just started thinking 9/11 threw us and the world for a loop. How do you deal with something like this on a nightly basis, and how do you deal with it, in Churchill's case, when you're running one half of a world war, you've got your family to worry about. His youngest living daughter at this point is 17. Just how do you go about surviving something like that? And it just happened to neatly coincide with his first year, because May 10, 1941, which was the end of his first year as Prime Minister, was when this first, most important German air campaign came to an end.
We should remind people, 9/11, of course, killed about 3,000 people in New York.
Yes.
But the Blitz that you talk about in this book, 40,000 dead?
Over 40,000.
40,000.
And over 50,000 seriously injured.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Absolutely shocking. Okay, let's go back to May 10, 1940. Churchill, summoned by King George VI, asked to replace Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister of the country. How was Churchill viewed at that time by the King?
King did not care, well, I don't know how he felt about Churchill personally, but as a likely next Prime Minister, he was not pleased. He did not want him to be chosen to become Prime Minister, even though the King, of course, was the one who was going to be in charge of that choice. But he came around in the end. He came to really feel that Churchill was the man for the hour. But for the first few months, no, he was concerned, because Churchill did not. We think of Churchill today as this paragon of leadership, which in many ways he is. But and we sometimes think of him as the guy who won World War II all by himself and so forth. But at the time he was appointed Prime Minister, there was a good deal of conflicting opinion about what kind of guy he was, what kind of character, and whether he was going to galvanize things or really screw things up.
And in some respects, he's a bit like the Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. He's 65 at the time, but if you take age inflation into account, it's almost like being in your high 70s back then, eh?
Well, yes, except that one thing I would say that came through to me very clearly in my own research into Churchill was that man, while not what we would describe today as fit, because he never went to the gym, never. He was incredibly vital, active, and quick. This man, when he led people walking through Bomb City, this guy moved fast, and one of his secretaries, John Culver, reports this moment when Churchill led him on a tour of the construction of what we know today as the Churchill War Rooms. And Churchill was leaping from girder to girder to girder and so forth. But yes, he was, in fact, in his mid-60s, and today that, of course, would have been like mid-40s, but he was in his mid-60s.
Right on. The relationship with America was, of course, absolutely key to his being able to successfully prosecute this war. And when he took over as Prime Minister, the father of the future president, John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy was the ambassador to the United Kingdom.
Yes.
How did the two of them get on?
Joseph Kennedy was very skeptical about Britain's prospects, and this annoyed Churchill no end. Annoyed not just Churchill, but others in his government, others in London. Happily, Joe Kennedy got replaced by another fellow, Wynant, who was much more to Churchill's liking. But the important thing I found, and as an American coming to this subject, I think I found or see or at least emphasize the courtship of America perhaps more than other scholars might, because to me it became very clear the extent to which Churchill, from the very first week of his prime ministry, understood that Roosevelt's participation, America's participation in the war, was vital to any hope of victory on the part of Britain. So much so that there is this moment in that first week when Churchill is shaving. He was still living in Admiralty House. He hadn't moved yet into 10 Downing Street because he wanted to give Chamberlain, the former prime minister, time to graciously leave and move on elsewhere. So he's shaving, and his son Randolph is sitting behind him. They're talking about the war. And his son Randolph is very skeptical also, and says, but essentially, Dad, he never called him Dad, but essentially, Dad, how could you possibly hope to win this war? Churchill throws his razor into the sink, whirls around and says, I shall drag America in. From day one, that was his strategy.
And we have to remember, again, we look at this story so much from the point of view of we know how it all turned out, but at the time, 1940 is an election year in the United States.
Yes.
And the Republicans have a very isolationist point of view.
Very
and
isolationist.
Franklin Roosevelt can't get, as they say today, too far out over his skis, or he's going to lose the election.
Right.
How did they negotiate all that?
But also importantly, Franklin Roosevelt kept to himself, very, very closely kept to himself, a clear declaration of whether he was going to run or not until really very close to the election. But yes, the political situation was very clearly one where he could not step out too far or politically be crushed because of this isolationist stance. And Churchill, to some extent, recognized that. I don't think he had the fullest recognition that he might have, and there was still a certain amount of miscomprehension between the two governments. But yeah, that was a real fundamental thing that Roosevelt had to worry about.
Let's set this up with an excerpt from the book. When Britain declared war against Germany on September 3rd, 1939, the government prepared in earnest for the bombing and invasion that was sure to follow. The code name for signaling that invasion was imminent or underway was Cromwell. The Ministry of Information issued a special flyer beating the invader, which went out to millions of homes. It was not calculated to reassure. Quote, where the enemy lands, it warned, there will be most violent fighting. When the attack begins, it will be too late to go. Stand firm. Church belfries went silent throughout Britain. If you heard bells, it meant that parachute troops had been sighted nearby. At this, the pamphlet instructed, disable and hide your bicycle and destroy your maps. If you owned a car, remove distributor head and leads and either empty the tank or remove the carburetor. How are people in Britain at this time feeling about their fate given this?
Well, see, this is one of the things also that came through to me. The certainty among most of the population that Britain was going to be invaded by Germany, and not just at some point in an indistinct future, but conceivably tomorrow. I mean, the prospect of seeing German paratroopers, landing in Hyde Park or, landing in the next door field while you're pruning your roses was very, very real. And if you can imagine that being the sort of the backdrop to the air campaign where you're being bombed, this is after the so-called Blitz actually began. I find it hard at times, I often find it hard to imagine just how terrifying that must have been, to have bombs falling every night, and then, the full awareness that once that succeeds or doesn't, but once it succeeds as people sort of expected it might, Germany was going to invade. And they weren't going to mess around when they invaded.
What's equally fascinating about your book is that you're not just telling the story from the side of the United Kingdom. You've got, you're into Hitler's head, you're into Goebbels' head, you're into Hess's head. And
especially Hermann Goering.
And Goering, indeed. And apparently, you tell us, Hitler really didn't consider a full-scale invasion of Germany until months after Churchill took over, right?
Yeah, it's the reality that, in fact, Churchill was very anxious about, Hitler was very anxious about the idea of invading England, invading Britain, because he had other plans, for one thing. He knew he had aspirations toward the East, toward the Soviet Union, and he did not want to have this second front behind him. But he was also just anxious about the prospect of an amphibious invasion in general. I mean, Germany did not have a particularly strong navy suited to this kind of thing.
But they did have the Luftwaffe.
But they had the Luftwaffe, and that's actually a big part of the story, because of this anxiety about trying to cross the Channel with an armed force. He became convinced, largely by the efforts of Hermann Goering, who founded this Air Force, and this was his beloved Air Force. Hermann Goering promised that the Luftwaffe could achieve, first of all, air superiority over Britain in no time, and then could proceed to essentially bring Britain to heel all by itself, to bring Churchill to the negotiating table, which is what Hitler really wanted for the first few months of Churchill's prime ministry. Churchill's defiance, his persistent defiance, brought Goering and Hitler, especially Hitler, to the point where enough is enough. Hitler, until that point, had explicitly forbidden bombing raids against central London, against civilian centers of population, because he did not want to further galvanize resistance by Churchill and the British. But since he was getting nowhere, then the decision finally was, okay, forget it. We're going to bomb the hell out of London, and they proceeded to do so. The first deliberate raid against London being on September 7th, 1940.
I presume you have imagined this, because you describe it so, amazingly in the book. The day skies, because they didn't bomb at night at first, right? They came in the daytime, and the skies are absolutely filled, virtually every square inch, with German planes getting ready to bomb.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you imagine what that must have looked like?
Well, I actually repeatedly tried to imagine this. I spent a lot of time in London. I would check into my favorite hotel, and I would often find myself musing, looking out over the horizon, let's say at dusk, and very lovely clear night now, but can you imagine looking out that window and seeing, hundreds of bombers filling the sky, and knowing what's going to come next, that the first thing is going to happen, they're going to drop incendiaries to start setting things on fire so that they light the path for other bombers to come, and that these raids, more than likely, are going to last all night. I mean, to me, it is incomprehensible how people confronted that situation. But of course, having ventured into that, research into that territory, I mean, I understand now how they kind of came to terms, how they had to come to terms.
And Churchill himself would go up to the roof and watch.
This is one of the things I really came to appreciate about Churchill. I mean, the man was, I do believe, fearless. When most sane people, I'm not saying he's insane, but when most sane people would dive for cover into the nearest shelter, Churchill, more often than not, would climb to the nearest roof to watch an unfolding raid. And he would bring staff or guests with him up to watch the raid. One particularly I found compelling moment. This gives you a sense of who Churchill was, and his steadiness, and also his intellectual heft. In one case, he takes a group of people up to the top of a nearby building to watch a raid unfold, and in the midst of this raid, he quotes Tennyson. He quotes a poem by Tennyson that sort of forecast aerial attack.
There's a passage in the book where you quote Churchill's secretary, John Colville, watching the bombings, and he wrote in his diary, "Never was there such a contrast of natural splendor and human vileness." Now, obviously, that line resonated with you so much that you made the title of the book that line.
That line resonated with me, yes, and literally, when I first read that passage, the title came to me and it stuck with me for 4.5 years. The passage in which he concludes by making that observation is a beautifully written passage where he talks about observing a severe air raid, particularly severe air raid, from a bedroom window, which of course is what one does, right? From a bedroom window. And he was just struck by how spectacular the night was. The sound of gunfire, the searchlight sweeping the sky, explosions, this, that, and the other thing, and what a contrast between this natural splendor and human vileness, and hence the splendid and the vile.
America was obviously shocked and appalled when Pearl Harbor was invaded, but we have to, I guess, assume that Churchill was secretly thrilled. Fair to say?
Not so secretly. No, Churchill more than anything wanted the United States to join the war as a belligerent. I mean, he courted Roosevelt, he courted America, as he himself said at one point, as, I'm going to fracture this quote, but basically the point was he courted Roosevelt as ardently as any lover courted the objective of his ardor, and in so many ways. And Pearl Harbor was, for Churchill, and I'm not exaggerating, was a gift from the gods.
Because he had to get America into the war.
He had to get America into the war, and it just was not happening as fast as he had expected. He was hoping for something better sooner, but this worked.
And again, take us inside American politics, because Roosevelt wanted to be helpful, but America was not in the war before Pearl Harbor, so there was limits on what he could do.
America wanted to be helpful. Roosevelt wanted to be helpful. He understood the political situation. He was as helpful as he possibly could be. He made various efforts to provide extensive aid. Nonetheless, not the least of which was to support and promote what became known as the Lendlease Act, which was an incredibly important act of legislation in terms of aiding Britain. But still, from Churchill's perspective, it was not enough. It was a good thing, and the most important thing was that the Lendlease Act was sort of, for Churchill, the equivalent of if you were a fly fisherman, hooking that fish. You didn't quite have that fish in your bag, but you had that fish hooked, and that was the Lend-Lease Act.
And just, for those who don't know, remind people what that was.
Yeah, that was an act passed after tremendous controversy, which was essentially to provide as much aid as possible to Britain without Britain having to pay for it until some obscure later point.
And it was not a slam dunk. I mean, it didn't pass the Senate.
It was not at all a slam dunk.
Close vote in the Senate.
Yeah. But when it passed, it was a very, very important thing. And that led to a whole another part of the saga that to me was particularly interesting, was where Roosevelt sent over, in January of 1941, before Lend-Lease was passed, he sent one of his first emissaries, Harry Hopkins, his close friend, a guy who lived in the White House, to sort of see what's really going on, behind the rhetoric and so forth. But after Lend-Lease was passed, he sent Averell Harriman at that point to be his, as he referred to him, his Lend-Lease expediter, nominally there to sort of determine who got what and how it was used and so forth, but really once again to sort of gauge what's really going on. What is this Churchill really like? And Churchill understood the game. Both guys, Hopkins and Harriman. He kept those guys close. He took them everywhere with him. He showed them everything just to further bring this country to his side.
One of the neat things you do in this book is that while you are describing the horrors of the war and the politics behind it and how Churchill is doing what he's doing, you're also telling us about his daughter Mary's engagement and whether that's going to go forward. There are all these details into people's private lives and who's sleeping with whom and all of this other business going on at the same time. How come?
Well, that's my favorite part of the story. That's how come. I mean, I really wanted to try to get at the day-to-day, how people coped with this situation on a day-to-day basis. When did ordinary life go on? When did it not? And one of my absolute favorite, my favorite character in the book is, in fact, Mary Churchill, again, Churchill's youngest surviving child. The Churchills had another daughter early on, Marigold, who had died at the age of 2. Really, tragic. Well, death is always tragic, but of sepsis. But anyway, here's Mary, 17, Mary is an incredibly bright, incredibly intelligent, vivacious, charming, accurate diarist. She kept a daily diary, literally daily diary of life during this period. And she talks about when her father became prime minister. She talks about her adoration for her father, you know, and she is such an exquisite commentator on the war and so forth, but she's also at intervals having a lot of fun. You know, she talks about, her parents had sequestered her at the prime ministerial estate Chequers. As parents do. I mean, you know, anxiety, you want to keep your kid safe. Now, Mary did not want to be sequestered at this place, and she complained. She wanted to come back to London. Parents were not having this. But while she was at Chequers, she would have really quite a nice time. She writes in her diary about sessions with young RAF pilots at the nearby bases, snogging in the hayloft.
Snogging?
Snogging in the hayloft.
Translate?
Well, I think you know what that means.
I think we get it. Okay, yeah.
I mean, not too far along there. And another practice of the RAF pilots that the girls, that Mary and her friends loved, was when the pilots would fly at treetop level over them. You know, these pilots knew what they were doing, and they're young, they're like 19, 20, 21, you know. They would come flying in these bombers and buzz the girls at treetop levels. And Mary referred to it as, I guess the girls referred to it this way, as beating up. That was called beating up. And they loved it. They loved it. That says, yeah. But she also talks about dancing and going to parties, and you know, and actually for her a couple of near misses.
That's the thing about the war, and I've had other people in that chair say it, that if you survived the war, it was an amazing time to be alive.
Very much so. Very much so. Yeah. One of my characters actually says that very thing. You know, it was a terrific time to be alive. And that character, Pamela Churchill, daughter-in-law of Churchill, she was married to son Randolph. She was actually afraid. She expressed fear or anxiety about what was going to happen after the war. You know, what was she going to do after the war? She spent all this time living, thinking the war. And what do you do after? You know, and that I found very revelatory also.
You talked about Mary's diary.
Yes.
What you didn't mention is, you read it, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that I was so happy with. You know, when you venture into a territory like Churchill, you know, you can always do the same old, do like a mass biography or whatever, and hope that in the telling you're doing something that's, you know, new and fresh and so forth. But when you open a fresh window on the past, which I did, nobody has asked that question. Well, specifically, what did they do during that first period to survive? And so when you open that new window, you find new things and you look at old things differently. And one of the things that I found, was given access to, was Mary Churchill's diary. And at the time I petitioned for permission to see it, after I won permission, I was one of 2 scholars, I believe, who had ever actually seen it. And going through this diary, I mean, it was just, honestly, I think it made the book. I think Mary very much comes alive, shows herself to be a living, breathing character. And the counterpoint throughout all these dreadful events is I think, very, again, very revelatory. I loved her diary.
Let's finish up on this. I wonder how much time you spent during the course of your research thinking about this notion. What if Churchill had been like every other normal person and at the age of 65 had retired from politics and somebody else had to carry the mantle of that mission for Britain during the war?
Okay, so yes. So speculative history. I don't engage in speculative history, but I have thought about this, mainly but in a somewhat different context. Churchill took a lot of risks with his own safety. The way I like to see it is, I mean, Churchill would never have retired, you know, willingly. But he took a lot of risks, like, for example, flying to France 5 times during the war before you know, the Blitz period, before France fell, 5 times flying with members of his government in his favorite Flamingo aircraft, two-engine passenger aircraft, through skies filled with Luftwaffe fighters. You know, I mean, anything could have happened. And plus, flying in that era was not that safe. Yeah. you know, and Mary expressed anxiety about him flying all the time, which I felt was a real connection to now and to me, because I hate flying. but you know, if that had happened, you know, who would have taken his place? And I you know, it's very tempting to say that nobody could have done what he did. It's very tempting to say that. I feel, however, that you know, people rise to the times as they are called upon to do. And I feel that somebody would have stepped in and done likewise.
Done likewise?
Done likewise in a very different way.
Well, Anthony Eden had his shot, and he was a bit of a dud, wasn't he?
He was a dud.
So
I'm not even saying it'd be Anthony Eden. You know, I don't, Lord Halifax, I don't even think that necessarily. But maybe somebody would have, maybe Attlee, you know, who became Prime Minister later. But it's speculative. It's so hard to think about that because Churchill was such an amazingly large and vivid character.
indispensable.
Indispensable character. Yeah. But he was not a great tactician. He was not a great strategist. He was an amazing orator, and I think his great strength as a leader was his awareness of the power of even the smallest symbolic act.
Well, we're always grateful when you make time for us and our viewers and listeners. When you have a new book out, The Splendid and the Vile is Erik Larson's latest contribution to nonfiction in this world, and we're so glad you spent some time with us at TVO tonight.
Thank you. Delighted.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.